Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar, The Retail Record Keeping for Establishments and Retail Stores. And with that, I'd like to turn the call over to Caitlin Keller from the Office of Outreach, Employee Education and Training. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Jamie. Welcome everyone to our webinar today on retail record keeping for establishments and retail stores that grind raw beef product. My name is Caitlin Keller. I'm from the FSIS Office of Outreach, Employee Education and Training, and I'll be leading us through the webinar today. I'll start with a quick overview of our agenda. Subject matter experts Pete Duryea, Staff Officer from the Office of Policy and Program Development, and Dr. Jerry Elliott, Acting Deputy Assistant Administrator from the Office of Investigation, Enforcement, and Audit, will provide an overview of the policy and enforcement of this rule. We'll then open up the line for questions at the end. If you'd like to submit your questions as they come up during the webinar, please submit them using the chat feature and we'll answer them during the Q&A session. But before we dive in, I'd like to first welcome members from our partner organizations for this webinar. Specifically, I'd like to thank Aaron Seagrass, President-elect of the Vermont Retail and Grocers Association, Mike Carbo, Vice President of Government Affairs for the Minnesota Grocers Association, and Chris Young, Diana Dietz, and Nelson Gatos from the American Association of Meat Processors. Thank you for your interest and assistance getting the information out to your members. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Peter Duryea from Policy Development Staff. Pete?
Yes. Hey, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for dialing into this webinar. And again, I want to thank our colleagues at OEAT for arranging this important session. So again, my name's Pete, and I've been in the agency for 30-plus years, and I work currently in Omaha on our policy development staff. We also answer questions through Ask FSIS, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation, but I'm just a little bit away on the computer, and you can reach out to me anytime. So if you don't mind, we'll start with our kind of introductory slides there, talking about foodborne illness outbreaks, slide number 6 on my show. We move into the discussion of how these foodborne illnesses cost us, $15.6 billion every year, and we have data in there from the CDC talking about 1 in 6 Americans contracting a foodborne illness, and the summaries of the hospitalization and the deaths. And so, anyway, it's just an important slide to illustrate that this is an important endeavor that the agency is on in order to reduce public health outbreaks, illness outbreaks. If we move to slide 7, one of our leading causes of a foodborne illness is ground beef, and so grinding beef, I am on slide 7. Ground beef can be manufactured from multiple suppliers and multiple production lots, and the pathogens that may be in the beef can be spread throughout each lot, especially if the food contact surfaces aren't properly cleaned in between. And we all know that consumer cooking practices often lead to ground beef being inadequately cooked, especially when they grill out. So anyway, let's move to slide 8. We started announcing our concerns with the pathogen 015787 way back in 2002, where we talked about we're going to start collecting samples at retail. That's Dr. Elliott's staff that would do that, and he can talk about that later. And when we did show up at retail to sample the ground beef, we would be looking for certain information, such as the name and establishment numbers and the supplier lot numbers and production dates, and we'll see later that those are actually what the final rule ends up addressing. So if we move to slide 9 next, it was recommended in 2009 via Federal Register notice that the retail stores would keep lot and batch numbers of the source materials and the exact name and the type of product produced. Advancing to slide 10 next. It asks, why do we need this rule? Most importantly, because it will improve our ability to trace back the sources of the foodborne outbreaks, and we can identify those source materials and see where else they may have gone and remove those from the food chain. It will also provide FSIS with proper documentation in efforts to trace the ground beef products back to the suppliers. I'm moving to slide 11 next. And yet, despite our efforts to tell industry how important it was to keep these records to facilitate this quicker trace back, it really wasn't explicit enough, and we found that we're going to need to do additional rule making to have those records be maintained. So our ability to trace back was not adequate under the current conditions, hence the final rule. So if we move to slide 12 next, we talk about the importance of cleaning and sanitizing equipment in many places throughout the final rule because it helps prevent the transfer of 0157 from one production lot to another. And then we have a little table there talking about when records were kept. You can see that the number of investigations that resulted in recalls is quite high, over 50%. However, if the records weren't available or they were available and incomplete, that number drops considerably. So that's just to illustrate the importance of keeping records and how it helps in these traceback investigations. Moving to slide 13, we got a picture of our 9 Code of Federal Regulations where you can find all of FSIS's regulations in parts 300 to 599. On a side note, you can access this electronically too if you go to eCFR, and that's updated frequently and contains all of this book in an electronic version that you can look at and find out what the regulatory requirements are at your computer. But the Act is cited in 21 U.S.C. 642, the Federal Meat Inspection Act, and it starts by the Act requires that official establishments and retail stores must maintain records that fully and correctly disclose all their transactions. And then in 9 CFR, those records are elaborated upon a little bit more, where we start talking about bills of sale and invoices and bills of lading or skipping papers. And there's also a regulation that requires access by FSIS personnel. If we move to slide 14, there's a little more history here, talking about in 2009, 2011, we had public meetings to discuss the traceability, and then at the same time, when we started work on this proposed final rule, and it took quite a while to get it to the stage it's at today, but in between 2014, we issued that proposed final rule, which was available for public comments, and the title is there, Records to be Kept. And then in 2015, we ended up publishing the final rule. And if we can go to the next slide, number 15, please. And they just cite where the authority for 9 CFR Part 320 comes from, and there it is, the authority given to us in the Act, 21 U.S.C. and 601 and 7 CFR. So main record-keeping provisions for the grinding activities are going to be mandatory record-keeping, where the records will be stored, and how long you have to keep them there. Slide 16 is next, please. And so this red text is actually the actual wording of the new regulations that reside in 320.1b4, where previously we had the transactions, fully and correctly disclosed the transactions. It wasn't enough, so we wanted to be more explicit on exactly what records were required to be kept, and hence the final rule, which resulted in these new regulations that you're reading about in red. So A is the establishment numbers of the establishments that are supplying the product. B are the supplier lot numbers, production dates. C is the name of the product, the beef components, the raw beef components you receive and grind. And D is the date and time that you make your lot of product. And then also the last one is about when you grind and then clean and sanitize the equipment. So those are the new requirements. If you move to slide 17, you'll see a sample production log that is in the final rule. We put this together several years ago, and anyway, you're welcome to use whatever mechanism you want to use as long as it enables you to keep track of that required information that was on the previous slide. And so anyway, there's example logs here, and I'm sure you all have access to different ones too. Moving to slide 18, and again, we talked about, we also had to talk about retention of the records and where they're being maintained. So there's new text in 320.1b4. Oh, this one is, I'm sorry, it also talks about the consumer grind aspect of it. And that particular product also needs to meet the regulatory requirements. The III talks about the definition found in the final rule where a lot of product is defined. The amount ground during particular dates and times, followed by cleanup until the next cleanup, during which the same source materials are used. Moving to slide 19 now, we're talking about the location of records. The important point here is that the records need to be maintained at the location where the beef is actually being ground. And the reason why is because we don't want to show up at the retail store or the official establishment only to find out that you got to go to corporate headquarters to find those records. Time is of the essence, and so the requirement is to have them available at the location where the beef is ground. Advancing to slide 20 next is the actual text that is now found in 320.2. Down in letter B there, again, reiterates the fact that the records must be maintained at that location. Slide 21 is about the revision to 320.3, where we define how long the records have to be held. 2 years after the December 31st year, meaning up to 3 years, you can read all that. But the second bullet is an important one, shortened it for beef grinding records to 1 year. So 1 year after the date of grinding is the important takeaway point here. If we move to slide 22, we can see that the red text again indicates the revisions to the 320.3 regulations, with the letter C being the most important there. 1 year, again, it reemphasizes that. And then slide 23 talks about imports. And so if a country wants to export, they're going to have to maintain and develop an equivalent system that enables trace back and trace forward. And so I don't know how that really impacts you, but it's there for you to look at. Slide 24, we're starting to get some of the questions that rolled in after we published the final rule. One of the questions was about which products are covered by the final rule. So again, it's important to know that the products that are covered are going to be products that are ground. That's the activity that occurs. So if it's not ground, then it's not subject to the final rule. So you can see the last bullet there in the picture. It shows a picture of tenderizing and needle injecting raw beef. Those products are not subject to the final rule. Doesn't mean you can't or might not be a good idea to keep those records, but it's not required. And then we also talk about the ground beef that's cooked. If you receive in raw ground beef and you grind it or cook and ultimately end up cooking it, then that product is no longer or is not subject to the rule. Moving to slide 25, we turn our attention back to the lot definition provided by the final rule, and again it just reiterates that it's the amount of product during particular dates and times followed by the cleanup, and so those are records you'll have to maintain on your log as when you clean up. As long as the date and the time of cleaning is recorded, the lot will be clearly identifiable, and we again say that we recognize that your lots may consist of product from multiple suppliers or multiple source materials. Ideally, they would be one supplier, but we know in reality that's not the way it'll work. Okay, slide 26, and then there were questions about the ingredients. What if I add some spices or other items to the raw ground beef? Am I required to keep the source records and the lot numbers and production dates from the supplier for those spices and those type of products? No, it's only the raw beef that must be recorded. And so another point is that this won't have any impact on the product labels. There's no additional labeling you'll have to do in order to comply with this final rule. Slide 27 was based on several of the questions that came into us here at the policy staff through Ask FSIS and through phone calls, where what if I receive a box of product in raw beef that I'm going to grind, and yet I can't find the production date or the supplier lot numbers. We're hoping that the production date and lot numbers are evident on the source materials, but if they're not, then we recommend contacting the supplier for the information, and in the interim, you write down any other available product identifying information that does appear on the box. So I don't think, in reality, I think most everyone puts production dates on their boxes. The lot number might be a little bit trickier. You may have to contact the supplier and ask which of the numbers on the label represents their production lot number. But if it's not there on the day you receive it initially, until you can get the kinks worked out of the system, write down barcodes and other product identifier numbers, and we'll go ahead and take a look at that information. So, slide 28. Oh, looks like Dr. Elliott's going to take the podium here, and I'll be back for the questions and answers part.
Okay, well, thank you, Pete, for giving us that part on the policy, and then, of course, I will discuss with you the enforcement of that retail record-keeping rule, and again, just for labeling, one of the things that we have discussed is that Of course, photos of those labels can be taken too, as long as they can be traced back to that lot of products. So there are many ways, as Pete mentioned earlier, that those can be kept. But if we can go to the next slide, please. The rule did become effective on June 20th, but the enforcement of that begins on October 1st, which is quickly coming up. During that interim time, the agency has been holding several webinars. The investigators, of course, as they go out to the retail stores, have been talking with those retail stores, explaining the rules, the new rule, and discussing with them the records that would need to be kept. And I always like to mention the fact that if and I understand that an investigator has not been to every retail store and probably will not be, because there are thousands and thousands of retail stores and only about 150 investigators, and so we don't get to all of those. The retail stores are primarily visited by state, local health authorities, but when an investigator does come, they do have credentials identifying themselves with a badge, and of course they'll show that too. And usually we'll give you one of their cards, and so you can always, if they don't, you can ask that and talk with them. A couple of the things, of course, that we're doing right now along with this one is the LM, the Retail Deli questionnaire. And so in some instances they may come to that retail store to do the LM retail questionnaire, as well as then taking a sample if you grind and the grinding meets the directive that we use for that. And so there may be a couple of things they'll be doing, as well as their normal surveillance they do at the retail stores when they're there. So if we can go on to the next slide. Again, it shows what Pete's already went over, but we just wanted to reiterate the fact that we will be, then the investigators will be looking for those records after October 1st, and we'll be expecting to see the items that Pete talked about that are in the final rule that are required to be kept. Again, as he said, you do not have to have a record exactly like this one, but that information somehow would need to be kept, either paper or electronically, depending on how you would like to do it. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk just a little bit then about how that final rule is going to be enforced. From October 1st to March 31st of 2017, when the investigators come to the store, again, they may do also the retail deli questionnaire if you have a retail deli with meat, poultry products, but they'll also then review the grinding logs and talk with the retailer, educating them on, again, exactly what needs to be done, what needs to be kept. And then come April 1st, 2017, we will reevaluate the enforcement next steps. What the plan is right now, and again, we'll see come April 1st, but if an investigator goes into a store and the retailer is truly trying to keep the records, maybe missing one of the items or a couple of the items, but really trying to do what the final rule says, then probably a letter of information is all that would be given. That's just reiterating what the investigator tells the retailer when they're there, explaining to them exactly what the findings were in the final rule. If they go to a store that has absolutely no records on file, whether they either haven't heard of it or just aren't keeping the records, then probably what would be done is a notice of warning would be issued, kind of like a warning speeding ticket that you could get be along that same thing, just saying, again, laying out what the findings were, giving you the regulatory authority, and then laying out what must be done to meet that regulatory authority. So we can go on to the next slide. And of course, then how will it be enforced? The investigators will follow the 8010.1 directive, and if you're not familiar with the fact, all of our directives are on the FSIS website. We're very open with that, not just the directives that the OIEA uses, the investigators, but for all of the agency directives. And so I believe at the end that will be talked a little more about of how to find those. But you can always do a search on our website for that 8010.1 if you would like to see exactly how the investigators do those in-commerce surveillance activities. And of course then for OFO, because this also applies to the federally regulated facilities where OFO, an inspector, is at every day, that consumer safety inspector will do the verification of the records that need to be kept. Okay, if we can go on to the next slide, please. One of the questions we've got asked, and of course has been a concern, is if we walk into a retail store, we don't find any records, will there be a recall? And recalls have a very definite definition of when and how we do them, and it's removing adulterated or misbranded product out of commerce, again, to meet the regulations. So no, in this case, there would not be a recall just because there are not records there. Now, if there's adulteration or misbranding, that could be different. But again, we would follow that protocol that the agency has in the regulations. So again, just because there are not records, there would not be a recall. Next slide, please. This gives you some websites for our FSIS website, some areas where there are some further information on this grinding law regulation, and then there, again, some discussion will give you some more areas where you can go into it. So I'm going to turn it back over to our moderator.
Thank you, Dr. Elliott. We'll go ahead now and we'll be opening up the line for our question and answer session. We have received several questions that came up via the chat function throughout the presentation, so we'll go ahead and start with those. I'm going to go ahead and just go in order here from Michael Quinn. It says, I buy full carcass beef. I grind in-house for sale using trim and primals. The last beef I received, the inspector made the slaughterhouse coarse grind all the trim. Is this what is supposed to happen?
This is Pete. So they buy in carcasses, and the inspector says you can't receive in a carcass. The slaughterhouse has to coarse grind it and then sell it to you. There's no requirement that you can't do that. The only requirement for the retail store, of course, is that you start with inspected and passed product as your source material. And so I assume the carcasses are coming in with the stamps on the hindquarter and the skirt and the chuck or wherever they appear, but that should be sufficient for you to do the rest, including breaking it down into primals if necessary, and then the subprimals, and then the specific cuts that you're going to use for your ground product. So if I understand the situation correctly, the inspector might be misinformed, and I'll be glad to visit with the person that asked the question and or the inspector. And you have my name here. I can give out my phone number. It's 402-344-5027, and we can all get together on the phone and try to figure out what's going on.
Thank you, Pete. We'll move on to the next. As I said, we'll move on to the next question, but if there are follow-ups to these questions, you can either type them in or follow up when we open up the line. The next question that came in through the chat feature is from Brent Ashford. If a small store just buys a piece of meat for grinding, how do they get the information? Because only the establishment number is on the piece of meat.
Well, this is Pete again. I'm having a hard time visualizing what you're asking, but yeah, that piece of meat again has to come in with a label on it, and you have to start with inspected and passed product, either from USDA or in a state that has their own MPI program. But you would write down the information that you find on there, and hopefully there's a production date, and hopefully there's a lot number in the absence of that. Then you would go ahead and write down anything that's on the label, a barcode, any numbers, whatever it is, and then try to get together with your supplier who sent you the meat and ask them, what is it that represents your production date, and what is it that represents your production lot on this label, so that I can go ahead and meet those new requirements on the records that I'm required to be kept. And so, again, we can visit about these on the phone. If you can give me a call or use Ask FSIS, I'll help walk you through the process.
Okay. Thank you, Pete. And the next question from Bob Adrian, is there going to be any talk about the new FSIS rule on additional E. coli intervention steps to be put into place for grinding whole muscle meats that are not specifically tested for grinding? Example, many butcher shops buy in chuck tenders, clogs, etc. We are being told this product is no longer good for grinding unless we place another prevention at the store level.
Well, I'm not familiar with that particular rule and or the scenario presented. Again, unless there's a regulation that shows up in 9 CFR that says retailers shall apply an intervention on any product that they intend to grind, then there's really no must to it. Is it a great idea? You bet. But again, we do have staff officers here that are wheeling and dealing in that particular issue, and so if you can use the Ask FSIS feature that we'll talk about later in the presentation to send in your specific concerns, we can sure get you an answer.
Great, thank you, Pete. And just to reiterate, like Pete said, we'll provide the information for Ask FSIS. We also have information we'll provide for the small plant help desk, so if there's a specific scenario you want to walk through with somebody that's unrelated to this presentation, you can certainly call the help desk as well. And that number is 1-877-374-7435. Again, we'll give that at the end of the presentation as well. We'll move on to the next question. Does ground pork apply to record keeping?
No. Just raw beef, raw ground beef. Beef, E. coli. We don't have a history of a lot of foodborne illness investigations due to pork products, and so consumer typically cooks pork very well. I don't know where that comes from, but beef, not so much. Beef, rare and very rare, and this and that on the grill. That comes a tradition of undercooking beef, but not so much pork.
Thank you, Pete. And another question from Bruce Boussier. Regarding beef ground from trim from various pieces, how should the records be kept?
Well, if you are producing raw ground beef and it comes from trim, then you're going to have to know the sources of the trim too and write all that down. So whatever component is used to produce your lot of raw ground beef, whether it's a primal or subprimal or a specific portion cut or beef trim, there's got to be labeling on all that stuff, and so you need to collect the required information, even if it's beef trim.
Okay. Thank you, Pete. And a couple more questions have come in as well, so we'll keep moving with those. Again, we will also open up the line after for any follow-up questions that people might have, or just to ask a question over the phone. The next question from Kathy Maloney. Is it possible to make the processors responsible for placing their supply codes and lot dates, et cetera, in a single uniform place on the box?
Well, in hindsight, that would have been a nice part of the final rule, and at the same time we issued the final rule for collecting supplier lot numbers and production dates, that we told suppliers that thou shalt put on a production date and a lot number, and then it would have worked seamlessly. However, we didn't anticipate that. No public comments came in about that, and so I'd like to say that we would have thought about it and required that. We didn't, but I think we can still get to the final goal together with a phone call or two, and write down that essential information as a result of the phone call. Because I do believe that production date's not that big it'd be unusual not to have a production date on the label, at least in my experience. But the lot number a little bit less so, and so it may require a little bit of extra work on your part to make a phone call or an email to your supplier and ask them where that information resides.
Thank you, Pete. And the next question, we are a state-inspected meat plant. Our state inspectors are telling us that starting October 1st, there will be new regulations that require everyone to either buy tested meats with COAs or that all other beef products must be sprayed with acid or hot water prior to grinding.
Well, again, that's outside the scope of this rule. In a non-designated state, they do have to have equal to systems in place. But as far as any requirement that I know of that says that you've got to have a hot water intervention or this or that, there isn't a USDA regulation that requires that. But again, states are able to determine if they want to have requirements above and beyond what the USDA requires. So again, those are kind of issues outside the scope of this rule. If you want to visit about that later, I'll be glad to visit with you, and you can contact me through that phone number or through the small plant help desk, or preferably through Ask FSIS.
And Pete, we got a follow-up question asking for your number to be repeated again, please.
Okay. 402-344-5027, and that's my direct line here to Omaha and the policy development staff. Now, we do have an 800 number for all sorts of different questions. I just happen to be the most involved with the final rule. Our 1-800 number is 1-800-233-3935.
One more question came in. I run 2 small retail butcher shops. One store works as a hub where all product is received and then is distributed as needed. No boxes are reused for safety sanitation reasons. How would you suggest we keep records in our other stores that do not receive direct shipments from suppliers and therefore do not receive supplier lot numbers and other information?
Well, you'll have to work out the system because, again, remember the slideshow said wherever you're actually doing the grinding, that's where we need to have those records maintained. So if one plant receives the information on the labels, somehow they're going to have to record that and transmit it to that second plant where the actual grinding is being done. I don't know if that answers the question, but if not, again, you can give me a call and we can hammer out some plan together.
Thank you, Pete. And at this time, I'm going to ask our AT&T moderator, Jamie, to go through the process for asking a question on the line. Jamie?
Ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a verbal question, please press #2 on your telephone keypad to raise your hand and place yourself into our question queue. You will hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please then state your name and question. Once again, pressing #2 will indicate that you wish to ask a question. And Caitlin, we did have a caller in the queue. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted. Caller, please make sure your phone is not on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, this is David Hallworth from Clark's Meat House in Riverton, Wyoming. And I'm curious, if I'm using the trim for a cooked product, do I still have to do all the record keeping? If I use my trim, like from all the different steaks and stuff, instead of putting it in a raw ground beef product, if I put it in a cooked beef product or save it when I'm going to do a cooked beef product, do I still need to record all this?
Well, David, if the ultimate product you send out that included that raw trim or even cooked trim, I'm not quite sure I visualize that, but if the ultimate product you produce after running it through the grinder is going to be cooked at your establishment, your retail store, and then sold to the consumer, no, you wouldn't be required to maintain any of that information. The only information that's required to be maintained is if you end up producing a raw ground beef product that's sold to the consumer as a raw ground beef product. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, because we make salami, summer sausage, and snack sticks for retail. So that's the cooked product I'm talking about. That's an all beef.
Yeah, cooked salami, no. Cooked meatloaf, no. Raw meatloaf, yes. Raw meatballs, yes.
Okay.
That help clarify things?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
And Caitlin, we do not have any other questions in the queue on the phones at this time. But we do have one that just popped in. We'll go to the line of Bob Adrian.
Hello, Pete.
I am here, Bob.
Yes, my name is Bob Adrian. I own a butcher shop in Wisconsin, and we're state inspected, and they're telling us that they had a federal audit that is now going to require all the state plants in Wisconsin to start another E. coli intervention at the store level, that because they're saying none of the letters of guarantee are from all the federal plants that you buy, chuck tenders or clods or anything like that from, are no longer, good enough, that because they don't specifically guarantee all the products for grind, that they're in turn saying that either you have to buy either the tested trim, the tested coarse ground beef, or product that has COAs on it. Well, currently, there's not really any choice product out there, whole muscle product being tested and sold that with COAs. Everything is like utility heel meat and things like that we don't, particularly want to grind. Again, we're being told that the Fed is forcing the state to put this regulation on us, but talking to everyone else, that doesn't seem to be the case. I've spoken to 3 federally inspected plants, none of which are being required to do this. They're doing the exact same thing we're doing, which is buying federally inspected meat, keeping all the, we've been keeping these grinding logs that you guys are, requiring. We've been doing that for 2 years already.
Thank you.
And, every batch number, we have a photocopy of every box and label of any beef we've used. We've, submitted submitted our tests to the state for E. coli and all those things, and now we're being told that none of that's gonna fly anymore. That either we're gonna have to put in our own intervention. If we can't buy the meat that's already tested, we have to put in our own intervention, which is ridiculous. So I don't know. I mean,
down at the retail level, I mean, we have very few regulations that extend down to retail. In fact, this is kind of one of the very first that, you know, impact you as a retailer, right? We have our retail exemptions described in 9 CFR 303 for livestock, including retail stores and restaurants. But other than that, this is one of the very first regulations that actually impacts directly down at retail. So again, we got to, it sounds like there's a breakdown in communication between the state and the auditors and must and required and shall and this and that. But that's outside of this particular scope. But I do have contacts, Bob, with the federal state audit branch. They just happen to be in the exact same building on the exact same floor as where I am today. And if you send in your concerns through Ask FSIS, have you ever used that before, sir?
No, I haven't.
Well, we'll figure that out in a minute, but I can help you with a phone call, arrange that. But that's the best way. You send something in writing through Ask FSIS. I go down and visit with the auditors and say, you know, the auditors are saying that you've got to do this, and the state's now passing that down to the retail level, and this, and we'll get it all figured out. You know, again, I'll go back to the fact, you know, in the absence of COAs and letters of guarantees and all those other things that we require at the official establishments to make sure that their HACCP plan is supportable and the determinations they've made in there are supportable. That's all described in one of our existing FSIS directives. Dr. Elliott talks about being able to see any of those, and that's in our 10,010.1 directive about when you go down and look at a plant's hazard analysis and HACCP plan, you know, that unless they get this in or support that or do this or squirt interventions on it, you know, that it calls into question the adequacy of those HACCP plans. Now, we all realize that HACCP and FSOPs don't extend down, not at least by USDA, to the retail level that you're at in Wisconsin, and so I'm not quite sure.
You wholesale a lot of ground beef as well to like restaurants and things like that.
Okay, so if you wholesale, then the state is going to have, you know, their own requirements, and Wisconsin does have their own meat and poultry inspection program, and if they've said you got to do things under HACCP and you've got to do that, then I can see where it might all tie together. But in any fashion, you know, this conversation probably outside the scope of this, but I'll be glad to help you with that particular issue. How's that sound?
Yeah, I appreciate that, and you know, we're with what a lot of people are looking at doing is just becoming federal inspected plants rather than state inspected, because, you know, just because of this, it's going to make it impossible to grind beef. I mean, realistically, I mean, without some severe consequences to the shop, you know, they're going to tie your hands to either buying substandard product or, you know, affecting your cost, you know.
Yes, sir.
Well, I appreciate it, and we'll get together afterwards or whatever. I got your number.
Well, you bet. When Caitlin's done here, I think we'll do another slide or two, and I'll just show you a screenshot of Ask FSIS.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
That's a good segue for us right now, unless there are any other questions. I'm just going to go through a few options if you have additional questions after this webinar. As Pete mentioned, we have Ask FSIS. The web address for that is www.askfsis.custhelp.com. It's on the screen. One of the nice features about Ask FSIS is that we publish all of the answers once they're vetted through Pete's group, the policy office, and those are published online, so you can see if your question has already been asked and answered, and it also provides an opportunity for us to share that information that might be useful to others. And so as Pete also, I know, gave his personal number as well for issues, this is great for anything that comes up outside of the scope of this subject matter as well.
Right. So you're on slide 37 taking a look at kind of a screenshot of it, and as Caitlin says, you go to that address and you click on there and you sign up, and it's real easy to sign up, name and address and a password and a little more information. You're ready to go. So when you open up the actual web-based feature of Ask FSIS, obviously it wants you to look for the answer to your question first, like, am I required to apply an intervention as a retail grinder when I grind raw beef or something, like that, and you go and look and say, there is no publicly viewable Q&A on that, so now I'm going to send in my question to our staff here. There's also an option to send in your labeling questions by selecting labeling from the drop-down menu, and you can also send in your export and import questions. And so anyways, it's really nice feature to have, and as Caitlin says, we won't put on your exact question. We'll look at the number of questions coming in, and if there's many people asking the same question, then we say, hey, we need to make this clear. Let's go ahead and develop a publicly viewable Q&A that everyone can look at. And so anyway, when you go and send in your own personal question and you select general inspection policy, it finds its way to us here in Omaha, and you can go ahead and put in parentheses, attention Pete, if you want, in the subject line, and I'll handle it personally. So you've got a very nice feature, and the best part about it is you get an answer back in black and white that you can print off and give to the state inspector or the USDA inspector or the compliance investigator. I get in questions from people talking about compliance investigators or, coming and looking around. So Jerry Elliott and I are just always in contact with each other, and I'll ask Jerry, for his feedback on an appropriate response. And so anyway, a very nice feature for you to be familiar with.
Thank you, Pete.
Yeah.
And the other option we have to go over for you today is the Small Plant Help Desk. The Small Plant Help Desk is staffed by my very knowledgeable and friendly colleagues here in the Outreach and Partnership Division who all have prior in-plant experience. They're available to answer calls on normal business hours, Monday through Friday, Eastern Time, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Of course, you can always leave a message after hours or email them at the email listed on the slide here, sphelpdesk@custhealth.com. We've also included a screenshot. They are in the process now of developing an archive of frequently asked questions similar to Ask FSIS, so that's something to keep an eye out for as well. The help desk is a great resource if you're having a really specific need or a question that might not be a policy-related question, but both options are available, Ask FSIS and the Small Plant Help Desk, and frequently communicate with each other to make sure that if you ask a question, we're making sure it gets to the right person within FSIS to get you the answer that you need. And just a quick note, if there are any members of the press on the webinar, or if you would like to request a speaker from FSIS or a representative of FSIS to talk at any events or articles, I've listed the telephone and email here for our Congressional and Public Affairs Office. You can email them at press@fsis.usda.gov or call 202-720-9113. And lastly, I just wanted to give you the web address for the final rule itself. And this was covered earlier, but this is just a snapshot so that you can see the web address. Sometimes it can be difficult to search and find the right piece of the Federal Register that you need. PDF of this presentation was provided to our partner organizations so that you have that information here today. And we'll go ahead and just ask one more time if there are any questions before we adjourn, and give the opportunity for you to ask any additional questions or comments that you might have today.
Just a reminder, you can raise your hand by pressing pound 2 on your telephone keypad. And Caitlin, there are no callers in the queue.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. So just to recap, if any of the additional questions come up, please contact Ask FSIS or the Small Client Help Desk or Pete via his number that he gave earlier. I want to thank our speakers again, Pete Duryea and Dr. Jerry Elliott, as well as our partners from the Vermont Retail and Grocers Association, the Minnesota Grocers Association, and the American Association of Meat Processors. Thank you for getting the word out to your members, and thank you to all of our participants for joining us here today. And I have one, I'm seeing one last question for the email addresses for presenters. So the email addresses, Pete, that would be peter.duryea@fsis.usda.gov, correct?
That's true. That's true. You know, of course, we prefer contact through Ask FSIS so we can look at all the questions coming in instead of to me directly in my email. But that's okay. I mean, if you want to use that feature, fine. Prefer to do it through Ask FSIS and just put attention Pete, and it's almost the same as email.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for your attention today.